believe. Oh, cool. I believe I think I got all of the trainers. You just call me up if you miss anything. I'll share the agenda. Okay, sounds good. Great. We have quorum in person and online. So I'm gonna kick off this meeting. Okay, welcome to our August pedestrian. Yeah, I'm just waiting for the figure speaking out. Less tables than usual. They're kind of different ones for adorable. Yeah. But you're right on time. So welcome to our August Pedestrian and Transit Advisory Committee meeting. Who's our acting secretary for tonight?
I believe she's joining on Zoom.
Hi, it's Bianca. It's me tonight.
Awesome. Thank you, Bianca. Do you have everything you need, the template and all that?
Yep, all set.
Amazing. Thank you.
Mhm.
So we'll start with our roll call. I'm gonna go through PTAC members and then I will ask just to emotionally prepare all you guests who are here. I will call on you at some point to just introduce yourself briefly. So get ready for that. But let's start first with Ted Alexander. Let's see, Ted. Ginny Alverson. Ginny. Caroline Bodiger. No. Meredith Brown. Laura Evans.
Here.
Christopher Perry.
Here.
Tim Gilman.
I'm here.
Preston Gutelius.
Here.
Satoko Harai. Here. Brenda Marvin.
Here.
Steve Mulder. Steve. Barbara Myers. Here. Bianca Norkunis.
Here.
Vitor Pamplona.
Here.
Zach Rosenberg will not be here. He emailed me. Alessandra Sider, I'm here. Rob Stansel.
Here.
Carol Garas. Moving on to our ex officio members, the esteemed city councilor at large, Willem Baugh.
I'm here.
Kate White. Here. And Justin Schreiber.
Here.
Great. Okay, like I said, I would love our guests to briefly introduce themselves. So what will happen is, well, I'll start with our two guests in person. And then for the folks online, when I get to you, I will press a little button that will make a pop-up appear on your screen that will ask you to unmute. And if you do that, please just say your name, your ward, maybe if you live in Somerville, and just why you're here tonight. But let's start with our folks in person. I'm going to ask Adam to get us started.
Hey everyone, Adam Polinsky. I am a city planner or a transportation planner for the city of Somerville. I'm here tonight to talk about traffic signals later.
Thank you for being here.
Hi everyone, I'm Nick. I live in Ward 6 and I'm interested in knowing more about what's happening in Somerville.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, online, Andy, I'm gonna go with you first. So you should be able to unmute now. If not, then that's okay. We will note you in the agenda. How about Joel?
Hi, I'm Joel from Ward 4 and just always love hearing what's going on in these meetings.
Thanks for coming again, Joel. We'd love to have you. And how about Karen?
Hi, Karen Malloy here. I'm in Ward 5. I'm a member of Somerville Alliance for Safe Streets, and I'm also here because I like to hear what's going on, but specifically the mobility topics tonight about the traffic signals and the project planning.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen. Always great to have you. And then finally, Tony Coppers.
Hi, I'm Tony, Union Square, just here to know what's going on.
Awesome. Sounds great. I think that covers everyone. So thank you all for being here. Having some trouble with audio, no problem, Andy. So moving right along in our agenda, to the very exciting topic of approving our July minutes. Does anybody have any requested changes, thoughts on the July minutes? Seeing none, I motion to approve the July minutes.
Second.
Great, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Great, abstentions? They are passed. Okay, I just want to give a brief administrative update before we jump into, well, more updates from the subcommittees, but the administrative one is, I just wanted to let everybody know about kind of a tentative meeting plan that we have for the fall. Just because we have been getting a lot of really great requests from especially our new members for agenda items, which is really great and super helpful, so keep them coming. We just couldn't get them on the agenda for this month for various reasons. So we wanted to give you a preview to know that your voices are being heard and that we are trying to get the stuff that you're interested in an upcoming meeting. So in the next few months, we are planning to have some presentations. One, a more in-depth presentation on how mobility decides what projects to take on, with a focus on how both PTAC, but also fellow community members can propose projects. And that decision-making process. So there'll be a little preview tonight, and then we'll dive in deeper to that over the next few months. We're also hoping to have a discussion on traffic calming, especially bicycle calming measures on the community path in light of the guest who joined us last week or last month to tell us about their crash a pedestrian that the cyclist crashed into. So some measures to address that. We'll also have a discussion on the West Broadway reconstruction, which is a project that we've been engaging on over the past few months. The city will have a 80% design ready for us to review, like we did for Tough Street last month. So that'll be coming up. Another thing that we will probably do next month, if not the month after that, that I really encourage you to start thinking about now, is that we want to do officer nominations. So currently I am what am I? I'm the chair of PTAC. Vitor is the co-chair, vice chair, and Carol is our secretary. And we would love for you all to consider whether you would like to step into a kind of leadership role like that. Just briefly, the chair obviously leads all the meetings, leads the agenda setting with a lot of input from the rest of the officers in mobility, and is kind of on call from the city, get calls from Brad a lot to kind of weigh in on topics, and kind of broadly sets the strategy of the committee with everybody's help. Vice chair has been a subcommittee coordinator to kind of make sure that all the subcommittees are talking to each other and being coordinated broadly. But also that is a role that Vitor took on. He stepped into the role, so it's not necessarily mandatory. It has been working very well, but I think that is a role that has a little bit of flexibility and room for your own interest. And then Carol's position as secretary manages the responsibilities for taking minutes each month. So that doesn't mean that she takes the minutes every month. It means that she asks someone else to take them and tracks who has been taking them on a month-to-month basis, and also make sure that the minutes get uploaded into the Google Drive. Are those fair representations of your positions? Okay, beautiful. They are not like low lifts, I'm not gonna lie, but I find it quite rewarding. I very much love being able to serve on this committee in that capacity. So if you feel like that is a capacity that you would like to serve in on this committee, or would like more information before you kind of make a decision one way or another, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, Vitor, and Carol, or any one of us individually. And we will have nominations before we have elections. So think about if you want to kind of put yourself forward in probably next meeting, maybe October, we have to decide, but we'll let you know.
I'll add that it's elections, but it's typically not like an adversarial, everyone's like fighting with each other to get to do these things. If you're willing to take on any type of leadership role, there's space for that. And we'd be, so it wouldn't be as if you're saying you think we're doing a bad job and you're trying to you know, take us out, like, that's not how we would take it at all, at all. So reach out and we can talk about that. And I think, or we can talk about the subcommittee.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And that will also have leadership roles involved, so keep that in mind when we get to the subcommittee talk as well. Yeah, great point, Carol, thank you. And then the last two things I want to put on your radar for the next few months of meetings. In October, Sergeant Mike McCarthy from the Somerville Police Department will join us to talk about a few things. One, the municipal road safety grant that they've been getting for the past few years, and how we can advocate for what we want to see included and not included in that grant. As well, and he'll also talk about how they've incorporated community feedback into their traffic enforcement practices over the past few years. And then we're also hoping to have the Department of Public Works come to visit us to talk about their snow clearing plan for the fall. Or the winter. Any questions about any of those things? Any other things that you're hoping to talk about in the next few months? Okay, great. If you do think of anything, please just email us. Moving on to subcommittee updates. Christopher, I think you're the only rep maybe from policy and enforcement here. Did you guys meet last month?
We did not meet, no.
Great.
Sorry.
Easy. Oh, no, no apology needed. Engineering and evaluation, did you guys meet?
No.
Education and engagement. I'm sorry to keep talking. I can't throw this over to Ted because he's not here, but we met on July 25th. And we prepped for our Union Square Farmers Market tabling. That was a lot of fun. We joined Kate, who was on the mobility side of things. Brenda joined us to volunteer. And we talked to a bunch of community members, and folks are really excited about our little buttons that we made. And we got some newsletter signups, so it's always a fun time. Our next tabling, we don't have it on the books yet, but we are planning to host a few more community walks once mobility announces their next round of street reconstruction projects. So we'll let you know about those. Okay, without further ado, I am going to pass it over to Adam to talk about traffic signals in the city with a focus on pedestrians and transit.
All right. Justin, you were gonna share the screen, right? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I need just permission or to be codes to be able to share. Thanks.
All right, so I want to keep this pretty casual with you all. I've got a few slides that I put together, and I talked with Kate and Justin beforehand about what you guys were looking for. And I think on a very basic level, I want to kind of give you just the state of good repair, you know, the state of the system of our traffic signals in Somerville, and maybe just give you a little bit of a taste of what we've been working on, how we think about traffic signals in Somerville. And maybe give potential topics or potential projects we've been working on with an emphasis on different goals. That maybe if it piques your interest, we could dive into deeper at a future meeting potentially, because every time I would talk about traffic signals, I've honestly learned something new from the last time I talked about them. And there is just so much information and nuance to it that it's really hard to both get someone who doesn't work in this space every day up to speed with the things we're struggling with, while also, you know, giving you a sense of like how we just try and meet some of those high level goals and how we actually, you know, advance our Vision Zero agenda. So it's definitely a balancing act. I'm going to do my best to keep it pretty high level today, and then just kind of dig into things and answer questions you guys want. So feel free, you know, maybe I'll get through the first 3 or 4 slides, which is just kind of like table setting. And then once you're starting to dig in a couple of the project examples I have, feel free to just interject and ask questions, and we can go from there. That sounds good. Cool. All right. So first, I feel like this is kind of assumed, but I do think it's worth stating and emphasizing that in the mobility division in the city of Somerville, we do believe that traffic signals are an important part of the transportation network. And I say that because that hasn't always been the case. at our busiest intersections, they really do like making sure that everyone is safe and can move through the intersection as efficiently as possible and not have to wait a long time is important to us. And in particular, as we become a more multimodal city, emphasizing pedestrians, cyclists, people walking, people biking, and people on buses is an emerging practice. And there's a heck of a lot of new stuff going on that we're trying to learn how best those tools can support what we ultimately want for those intersections. As I just alluded to, this was not always the case. For a long time, Somerville signals were technically being managed by the Traffic and Parking Office, which is now just the Parking Office. The traffic engineering position used to sit there. And I bring that up because there just wasn't a lot of investment in signals, and it just wasn't a priority. And on one hand, I want to give them credit and say, you know, I think compared to other places, that means that moving vehicles just wasn't that important. They just had other things to focus on, and protected bike lanes and bus lanes weren't a thing, you know, 10, 20, 30 years ago. So they just weren't, they were really kind of just safe, you know, they were fine with things as they were. And so it was just kind of decaying. On the other hand, it does mean that there weren't a lot of opportunities to really even focus on pedestrian improvements. And so we've kind of inherited what is a pretty, it's a pretty rough system in terms of the age and the things that we're able to do. However, that mentality and that prioritization kind of pivoted a few years ago when the traffic engineering position moved to the engineering department. Mobility was also kind of starting to dip our toes in the water, and me as sort of the person on our team with an engineering background had started to look into how we could utilize signals a little bit more to advance our multimodal goals. And that kind of came together, and me and Jessica have been working together now with the support of the greater mobility team. And now we actually have a second traffic engineering position in engineering. We've all been working together to slowly build out that practice and rethink, like, what are the things that drive signals in Somerville? What are we trying to achieve? And how do we continue to invest in this asset that we have? Because we think there's a lot of opportunity there.
And can I jump in? That
Yes.
Jessica Bello, our traffic engineer, used to be on PTAC. So
Yes.
just keep that in mind. Ally in there.
Pedestrian first mentality with Jessica for sure. So with that as the preamble, we basically had no information, and we knew this was an old system. And so we just started by taking a very basic inventory. Like we literally didn't know what every signal in Somerville was doing. We were very much at square one. And so me and Jessica started going around, and we just started opening up what's called the traffic signal cabinet on the side of the road. It's the big metal box that you guys will see usually pretty close to the intersection on the sidewalk. And just seeing what was going on and just documenting it, because that was literally where we are. Where you could have asked us a question 4 or 5 years ago, we would have been able to tell you what a given signal was doing for the most part, with the exception of a few ones that we had to be upgrading at the time, like Beacon Street, as an example. So that's where we started. Next slide. What are our goals? It kind of boils down to a few basic things, with the emphasis being on Vision Zero and improving multimodal safety for our most vulnerable users. We really want to enhance the experience for people walking, biking, and people on buses by improving safety and accessibility, first and foremost, by improving convenience where we can. Oops, forgot to take out a word there. I was going to say for pedestrians in particular, because they're not always sort of baked into the system. And reducing wait times for all of those modes. And what are our challenges? I won't beat a dead horse here, but the signal system is old in many cases. And so there are all these kinds of cool ideas for things that we want to do, but don't always have the capacity to do them without investing $100 or $200 or $300,000 to first upgrade that system. Not always the case, but it does put us in a bit on our back foot a bit in terms of what we're able to do if we want to make a quick change, right? The second goal, and I think the one where we will have discussions with you all going forward and where we often struggle, is even when you have the ability to design something from scratch or to make all the improvements that you want and kind of tell it to do what you want, we still struggle with what we actually want it to do. When it comes to a signal system, it's sometimes me making a choice between modes. And in this case, it actually might even mean making a choice between the two modes that you guys talk about the most, which are buses and pedestrians. So for example, we often run into this case where saying we want to get more buses through faster, that can mean increasing the amount of green time that, say, let's take the example of Broadway at Temple Street. We may want to increase the amount of green time that it has so that the buses can get through. However, if we're doing that, that also means that pedestrians have to wait that much longer to then cross the street. And so we have to balance these things and figure out what is our policy? How do we make all of these things work together best, knowing that it's not always, there's no silver bullet, right? And so I think that's one of the places that we struggle the most and can definitely get input and have a conversation and continue to work through this with PTAC. So with that, I will dive into a few examples of specifically a project that we've been working on where we have been trying to focus. I'm kind of like emphasizing one of these goals for each of these projects, and then I'll end with one where we are kind of trying to balance it all and going through an example I just talked through of like, okay, if we kind of could do whatever we want, how would we actually do it? And so these are the 4 bullets, and I'll just kind of skip this for now, Justin, and kind of talk through each of these individually. So the first, improving safety and accessibility. One way that the city has been doing this, and some of you guys may be familiar with this effort, we actually just sent out a little post in our mobility newsletter about this effort. We are trying to lengthen the crossing time for pedestrians and upgrading signal equipment at various intersections around Somerville is kind of a really quick win, easy effort to make a pretty substantial difference. This started in 2021 when Jessica came on board and we had a little bit more capacity to actually tackle this. And most of our signals in Somerville that we own, at least, we have about 65 city-owned signals. I think there's like 80 total, so that, you know, about 15 are owned by MassDOT or the DCR. Most of the ones that we own, we've now sufficiently increased the pedestrian time because it was pretty short to the standards that we use, which uses a pedestrian walking about 3.5 feet per second, which I wish I had a good metric, but it's someone definitely walking on the slower side. Like it's definitely longer than we had timed it before. So in a lot of cases, I'd say the average was like by 3 or 4 or 5 seconds was about how much longer we were extending it. And when you're talking about, you know, Highland Ave, where it was 8 seconds of that, we call it the flashing don't walk phase, where it's like, hey, you know, you shouldn't start crossing now. Like you were accounting for the time that takes you to get across the street. 8 seconds is a big difference when you go up to like 13 or 14, like that really makes it a lot more comfortable. So in some cases, we're almost doubling it, which is great. So that has been kind of an easy effort for us to make a difference that didn't require a lot of money. It really just required staff time. The caveat there being that when it comes to upgrading the equipment, so the push buttons that you see on the side of the road and the actual signal face, we've been trying to upgrade those so that there is a countdown timer that shows how much time you have to cross and make sure that when you push the button, ideally we don't want anyone pushing buttons, but if you're visually impaired and you need to be able to orient yourself on the street, we are still upgrading those so that there is an audible detection and audible signal so that they know when it's safe to cross and which direction they're going. So that does require a little bit of investment on the time side, or sorry, on the financial side. But Jessica has been working over in engineering to upgrade at least 5 signals per year outside of our other bigger projects to make a difference there. We have also been working to improve convenience, particularly for pedestrians, which I just alluded to in terms of making sure that pedestrians don't have to push the button by increasing the number of signals where the walk sign comes on automatically. So kind of as part of the same effort, we were not only increasing the amount of time that pedestrians had to cross, but we wanted to make sure that they didn't have to push the button whatsoever. This was originally a COVID measure, and then we decided that this was the best practice and policy that the city of Somerville wanted. And so we kind of were doing both as we were like noodling around in these cabinets and figuring out how they actually worked. Jessica would go around with a little wheel and measure the longest crosswalk. We'd do a quick calculation, determine how much time we added, and then I would be pressing buttons and making sure that the pedestrian phase came on every time, because most of our signals have what we call an exclusive phase, which means that all the cars stop and then pedestrians at every leg of the crosswalk get to go. And so we would make sure that is not common practice in a lot of places, and definitely wasn't when we started this effort 5 years ago in Somerville. And we have been slowly working to make sure that that is the case for as many intersections as possible. There are a handful where that still doesn't exist. In most cases, it's because the signal is just there for pedestrians. So if, you know, it's gonna be green otherwise, you kind of want it to be on demand for a pedestrian to push the button. Feels arbitrary to just set it to some random amount of time. And then there are one or two cases where like Highland at Medford is an example. It's really close to McGrath Highway. So having that one, which would be really long, come up regularly, having traffic spill back into McGrath Highway because those two are so close together poses a different safety problem at the McGrath intersection, because then you have cars going through that crosswalk. And so there are a couple of locations where we have decided it doesn't make the most sense from a pedestrian priority perspective. But on that map, you can see all of the blue circles, which are where it does come on automatically now. And Kate and I are going to work with Nick in our comms office at some point, I don't know when, to figure out how we message this outside of like a space like this and take this map and actually maybe put signs like that on the street. So actually that could be a really good opportunity to get PTEX involvement and figure out, you know, brainstorm how we could maybe make that happen and how we can better communicate this. Two more slides. Here we start to get a little bit more on the high tech side. When it comes to reducing delay, particularly for people on buses, it usually involves a little bit more software. You need to have a camera, for example, that can see a bus, or some kind of software that can locate the bus based on its GPS coordinates, to then feed that into something that can say, please give a green to Broadway. And so we didn't have anything like that for a really long time. We're actually up until very recently, and the MBTA wanted to work with us and fund a project and manage a project where we would deploy this software that's called Through Green, of which you can see a screenshot here of what it kind of looks like on their interface, with the green being the intersections that we have that are part of this effort, and then the black actually being buses that are running. Don't ask me how they picked those buses that are showing. I don't know if it's Somerville's the boundary or where the boundary is. It's still very new. But to me, it's really cool that for the first time ever, we can actually see, you can dig into what's going on at these signals that we own virtually. At every other signal in Somerville, you actually have to go out there to figure out what's doing, or if you want to make a change. And you can see how it interfaces with MBTA buses so that we can determine if it's actually doing what we want, right? Because we rolled out a software here a few years ago, and it was very rudimentary. And we thought we were getting like high-end TSP at the time, only to find out that MBTA actually didn't even know entirely whether it was working. And so now we can start to back check this and verify and have more of a working, like I can now, but from the comfort of my computer, go in and just watch this and see what the signal is doing, see what the buses are doing, and we can start to ask better questions about whether or not this software is actually doing what we want. Because it's all very new, and it's all like, it's an evolving practice is what we're learning. So with the last slide, I will talk about how we're trying to balance all of these goals, which, as I mentioned, can also get very challenging when you have to make decisions about how much you prioritize a bus getting through versus how long you make a pedestrian wait, for example. In Davis Square, I'm sure most of you have been through Davis Square in the last 6 months and have seen that we upgraded a lot of the equipment. A lot of the things you can actually see was made to try and make it clearer for people, right? Like we have flashing yellow arrows now that say, hey, a driver can only cross this crosswalk after you've made sure that you've yielded to a pedestrian. Or we've made sure that there's extra signage or extra signal heads to show that like, this is the way you go if you're in the right lane, or this is the way you go if you're in the left lane as a vehicle. And those are the more tangible things. There is a lot of stuff going on in the background that we're now just getting access to in the last week or two. That is both collecting data. So I actually just pulled this right before I came over here. This is how many vehicles and pedestrians were captured in Davis that went through Davis Square yesterday across the day. So that's an hour by hour breakdown. The light blue is pedestrians and the dark blue is like standard motor vehicles. So all your sedans and pickup trucks, etc. And then there's some smaller ones where it captures bikes and buses. And really big trucks. And that is kind of like, we're getting that information all the time now on a rolling basis for Davis Square, which is really cool. We've never had anything like that before. And so we now have our first permanent counter, and this software is then taking that And it's making decisions about, should I add more green time to this approach? Should I take away green time from this approach? And we still have a lot to learn about how well it actually works, but we have the capability to understand whether or not it's working the way we want. And that's where it starts to get into what parameters have we set up, right? Like, will we allow it to give an extra 20 seconds to Holland Street to get a bus through? Is that worth making pedestrians wait 20 seconds when trying to cross Holland Street? And that's kind of at the place we're at now, which is like, we're finally getting access to some higher tech software. And we need to start figuring out what is the right thing to do and what is our policy for how we want to implement these technologies as we do more of these projects going forward. So with that, I will stop talking and answer any questions that you guys have if we have time.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for being here and presenting this. I have a question about the all PED phases. And about just even whether it's technically, I realize that there's time involved in visiting the signals and making any changes system-wide. But is it even like technically possible in terms of the hardware and software of the signals to provide like a PED signal with the green in the same direction in addition? Because I feel like there's a lot of intersections where there's an all PED phase, but there is a green phase for vehicles that pedestrians can cross with, but they do have a red signal, and it creates a little bit of confusion.
Yes, yeah.
And so is it possible to allow pedestrians to cross with traffic? Particularly on places where right turns are restricted on red, like, is that something that would provide a lot more signalized walk time for pedestrians if it could be like a both and?
Yeah. The short answer is it's highly dependent on the intersection. It really does depend on the equipment that is out there. Jessica and I have been surprised in cases where we thought it wasn't possible and it was, but also in cases where we thought based on everything we knew it was, and then it turned out it wasn't. We don't have any of that capacity in-house. So it's not a matter of like changing green time, which is something that Jessica and I can do. We can, add 5 seconds to this approach or that approach. And we can even turn on making sure something comes up every time. We can't change the way it's phased. So we can't have, we have to have someone come in from like a third-party vendor who we work pretty closely to actually evaluate it. And then based on their, like, it starts very quickly getting like electrical engineering. And we don't have that capacity in house. So we have to have someone come in and evaluate it and determine whether or not it's possible. So it may very well be in a lot of cases. We're trying to figure out how we can fold that into a larger effort, because oftentimes it's not worth just doing the one-off. Like, a good example, like for me, what comes to mind is Highland Ave, because there's a lot of one-ways where it is perfectly safe for a pedestrian to cross at while Highland is going. But I don't want to just do that for School Street without at Highland Wall, without thinking about Central Street or Lowell Street down the road. And so we just haven't had the time to break free and actually do that full evaluation. And we also don't want to do that and then find out that it's not possible. So it's kind of a balance. We're being a little bit opportunistic, where it's like there happens to be a project that the MBTA wants to work with us on, where we're already going to be looking at it and we determine whether or not we can actually make it happen. So I know that's not a super clear answer, but that's kind of where we're at.
And just to add to Adam's point, the Davis Square opportunity was through a federally funded project that we got through the region's sort of metropolitan planning organization, but we had allocated federal funds that allowed us to totally change all of those signals, adding in transit signal priorities. So kind of using that opportunity in collaboration with the team who managed the project.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is something that we are looking at for all new projects that we undertake where signals might be involved. Like, that's very much a policy that we want to deploy. We just we're not at the place where that can be a standalone project. Basically, it's like as part of the Davis Square project or as part of this other MBTA project on Broadway. We're definitely looking at it, but yeah, we're just not in a place where we're doing it as its own thing.
As you've been collecting all of this new data, what is something that surprised you?
Let's see, not to be too cheeky, but with and some of the MBTA stuff, I was actually surprised to find out that no one really seemed to know exactly what rules were in place in terms of how the TSP was running. So with our Through Green pilot, it was definitely like, it was interesting because we've been struggling to get a clear answer on what our signals are doing. And so it was really good to have the data to back it up, to be like, no, like this is exactly like, we've been promised TSP, this kind of vague term for like getting buses through. We're at the point where Jessica and I now feel comfortable enough to ask questions about like, okay, what does that actually mean in terms of what you're deploying? And what it's doing in different circumstances. And we're still trying to get that answer from our vendor and from the MBTA. And to the MBTA's credit, like they're as interested in this as we are. They are paying for it, like they're managing it. But it is kind of this like weird, tricky, nebulous thing. And so saying you wanted to do something is a little bit different than actually doing it, and what happens when the rubber hits the road, so to speak. And so that has been kind of enlightening in the sense that like, it's a little humbling, to be honest, because like we're trying to finally get a better grasp on all these complicated things that our signals can do. The goal is simple. We just want to get buses through faster, but how that happens is way more complicated than I think any of us realize. And really even more complicated, I think, the MBTA realized. So that's definitely one piece. It's also interesting, like in Data Square, just how much the volumes can fluctuate from day to day. Like we all kind of feel it sometimes that there's heavier traffic and lighter traffic, but now we can actually like point to something that says like, oh yeah, there was like 2,000 less cars today. Like that's a 10% change between Tuesday and Wednesday. And so like now we can ask those questions and be like, why might that be? So that's been really awesome too.
I was surprised at how consistent that data and when we were showing that graph, like it was pretty close to the same for the majority of the day.
Yeah, we're starting to see that. So we have a sense of how that stuff is working on a citywide scale through these like point in time data collection efforts that we do. So every spring we collect data at a few intersections, every fall. And so we've been seeing those trends emerge in kind of a like point in time basis. So that part isn't super surprising to me because we are seeing just this like this mass of vehicles in the PM now. Like everyone, like I think the most surprising part to me was like traffic was as heavy at like 11 PM as it was at like 10 AM, which is kind of wild. But it is just this, it just kind of grows now. It used to be very like a lot of cars at around 7, 8 AM and then a lot of cars at 5 or 6. And now it's just very spread out across the day, which is fascinating. And in Davis, I think that's particularly pronounced.
I apologize if I missed the answer, but that data collection, does it come with software that also lets you trivially model changes? In other words, if we add 5 seconds to this crosswalk in Davis Square, the data just shifts and you can see what happens.
To be determined.
Okay.
We don't fully know what all the capabilities of this software are yet. We keep getting different answers and I'm getting a little bit skeptical of this vendor. It seems like they can do some really cool stuff, but they also told us that this would be done in June and we're in August and I still don't have a clear answer for you guys. Like we just got access to the data. They're still telling us that the algorithm that actually is the thing that pushes and pulls green time, et cetera, that is still not running as of today. So we're not even at the place, we still need to get trained up on it technically. We still need to understand what it's doing and make sure it is working. And then we will be asking those questions. So I would like to think so. I don't know that for sure. It may be something that happens in the background with this algorithm, but TBD. There's still a lot to learn on this. It is a complicated software, so I'll give them credit there, but like we're gonna get there.
Question that Carol.
Kind of on that, I was curious, did they, in the validation of that software, how well does it work with like a child in like a carriage or like stuff like that, like identifying children or things like that?
That's a question that I want to follow up on too. Like, it's great that we have this now, but I think we need to be very skeptical in terms of like, are these accurate numbers? I think this software is more, it's a company called MyoVision, and they've kind of been the leader in traffic camera detection for a while. So I feel more confident in their like detection availability than a lot of other places, but I don't know for sure. I'm sure they have some research papers that they can point to. That is definitely going to be on our follow-up list to figure out how accurate is this and how well is it working, how much can they rely on it.
Would it be, I mean, with this pretty cool new data source, assuming it turns out to be at least sort of accurate, which, you know, probably somehow related to reality. Is there any interest in or ambition towards or goal of also publishing and releasing this data to the public? I might be overestimating how many people just want to, like, for fun, get in and analyze the data themselves, but some people might, and that could be interesting. And I realize that there could be concerns around, you know, liability, especially where you don't have a good handle on how accurate the data is at this point. But is that something worth working towards? Is having us potentially be a really cool open data set?
I think it could be. I think right now, I don't see that being something that this software could provide in its current state. So I think the best we could do is take snapshots or like develop reports ourselves and then upload them to the city
You don't
website.
have the ability even for yourself to download raw data, like in the form of just.
I haven't tried yet, to be honest. I'm not sure. Maybe. I would assume we do have that capability. And so I think that would be something that we could definitely talk about. I think like giving access to the platform itself would probably be trickier. But I think there could at least be like point in time reports that we could give and be like, hey, here's what we found in Data Square last month. So honestly, we haven't really started those conversations yet. So it's an interesting question. I think it's something it feels like something we should be working towards. So.
I had a question about, the rapid flashing beacons and the hawk signals. Because we have a fair amount based on that map, more than I was actually expecting. So I'm just curious whether we have like a strategy moving forward for how we want to deploy this. I know, like talking to Kate, for example, like some members of the, community who had, like visual impairments or sensitivities or expressing concern about the flashing beacons. And then also, I don't know who doesn't have concerns about hawk beacons. So I'm just curious how you guys are thinking about that.
Yeah.
Going into the future.
Yes, we actually started a sort of multi-departmental working group to assess various street design policy issues. Believe it or not, we kind of developed, for a long time, we've been developing our policy as certain projects have gotten rolled out. We use those projects as opportunities to come together and like make design decisions. And when it comes to things like traffic signals, especially with having Jessica on board, we use that opportunity to kind of like say, no, we need to think about this outside of just the next project and develop more very basic policy. And RFBs and hawk signals are two of the things that we knew were kind of like important things to actually develop policy around. So with the hawk, and none of this is official yet, like I think the goal would be to work towards like a street design guide where we do publish all of this information. Right now, it's kind of like if someone requests, we will respond to 311 with our general policy. We'll talk to you guys about it. So I think the goal would be to work towards documenting all of this, but for now, it's just kind of in like an interim state or like an internal state. But I can tell you that our policy on hawk signals is that we basically don't feel like they're appropriate almost anywhere. In that the only place we'd even really consider them is on a road with at least 4 lanes of traffic. And so basically just like McGrath Highway in its current form, at least, is the only road that we really, maybe Alewife Brook Parkway, again, in its current form, or Mississippi Ave. I think really the state roads are the only streets we'd even entertain the idea. And even then we have pretty strict guidelines around like doing a study to determine whether or not it's truly warranted. RFBs are a little different, I think, on some of the wider streets in Somerville, like Broadway or Washington Street, or Somerville Ave stand out to me as examples where we would consider them. In particular, I think we're gravitating towards around areas with particularly high concentrations of our most vulnerable users, senior housing, disabled housing, schools. I think particularly the youngest and the oldest, I think, are really where we at least want to consider whether or not that continues to be a tool. But we did hear from the Disability Commission years ago that like we need to be very cognizant about deploying tools like that, and we took that seriously and are trying to be very judicious about where we deploy this.
Would anyone like a definition of a hawk signal? We just use a
Yes,
couple
I
of
was trying
different
to
terms.
Google that, and I was like, I don't know what this is.
No, don't worry, and please ask those questions as we toss around different terminology, and in particular, signals have all these different names. So Adam, would you be able to describe the hawk signal? And we did talk about RFBs at another time, but maybe just as a refresher.
Yes, so if if you've been on Beacon Street, there are two hawk signals there. We also have one on Mystic Ave. And it's at just a standard crosswalk, but there's this overhead square signal face that has two red bulbs and one yellow bulb. And so it goes red when a pedestrian, or sorry, it goes yellow when a pedestrian pushes the button, and then it goes yellow and then goes solid red. And obviously that, you have to stop as a car, pedestrians get to cross, and then it toggles red, the two red bulbs, and that is supposed to mean that a driver can proceed if the pedestrian has cleared the crosswalk. There's been a lot of confusion whether or not that actually works as intended. It's something that was developed for much higher speed areas, like I think it's called a hawk because they somehow molded the acronym. I think a hawk is the state bird of Arizona, and that's where they were first developed. And they have much wider roads than we do, and areas where really people shouldn't be crossing the street at all, but this was their attempt. Yeah, perfect. Picture's worth 1,000 words. There's a hawk signal. So we have two of those on Beacon Street, and we have one on Mystic Ave, and at this point in time, we do not have any intention of putting any more. And then an RFB is probably a little easier to describe. That is just a standard pedestrian diamond yellow sign, and then below it, there are two little bars that just flash rapidly. They're rectangles that flash rapidly, hence the name. And so a pedestrian pushes a button on the side of the road. We actually have one at the crosswalk on Holland Street at the Davis Square Plaza. TBD whether or not that was the best place we could have put one of those. Union Square has one, that's another good example. And yeah, you push the button and it does that toggle, that yellow flashing toggle. And that just means, cars have to yield, and it just gives a little bit more, maybe a little bit more comfort to a pedestrian crossing to say, hey, this is my space and I'm just crossing.
I do want to note, we are at our agenda time. So these will be our last two questions and or comments. Go ahead, Preston.
You can kind of do a quick one. How often do you come across the signal? You're like, maybe we don't want, it's not worth changing the signal. Like the cost to invest and redo it, it'd just be better to put like stop signs in, just get rid of it entirely.
We've thought about this a lot, and in general, we would like we actually have a Vision Zero action plan goal to remove unwarranted signals. I think upon further reflection, we want to be very careful. Like, I think the corridor does make a difference, right? Like having a signal on Broadway at Boston Ave, for example, or, let's use the case of Broadway at Temple Street. And then say, even if it wasn't warranted, to then put up stop signs at Broadway School. I just we want to be careful about setting expectations about what people are actually going to see at these intersections. And so just because we we're thinking a little bit more about the broader context. So on Broadway, I think we're going to be hard pressed, except in maybe certain very specific examples or Somerville Ave, to remove signals en masse. Summer Street might be a different story. So we don't have any hard plans yet to remove any signals at this point. But I think we're trying to think about it from a slightly bigger scale than maybe we first did when we developed the Vision Zero action plan goal. But overall, that's kind of where we're at for the most part. Most of the signals that people are coming to us about, or that we're thinking about, or that MBTA is interested, are warranted, and we don't really have any intentions. We think we can do more with the existing signal system or upgrading it than we can by simply removing it. Usually that works better when there's just less traffic and less volume, because then pedestrians can just go. They don't have to wait at all. And that's something we love. But if you have 10,000 cars a day, which is, a street like Webster Ave or Prospect Street, pedestrians aren't going to feel safe just walking out the street most of the time, even if it stops. So,
cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
As a pedestrian, I say, please don't remove lights. People don't stop in crosswalks, and a light gives me a little more hope.
Got it. Thank you.
I was wondering if you know what the effectiveness is in safety with the flashing lights. Does it actually reduce fatalities and crashes, or is it just a way to make people feel better?
Great question. That's a good one. We've actually been studying this a lot over the last few years because we are trying to figure out the answer to that ourselves, and there's not a ton of good research across the country to help us answer that. So we've kind of taken it upon ourselves to start to understand where thankfully, we don't have enough crashes in Somerville to actually garner enough data to make decisions about trends and what's happening at any given location at like the scale we'd like, which is like individual crosswalks. So we do have to rely on what we call compliance studies, and if someone goes out there, oftentimes it's something we'll hire a consultant for, and they'll send out an intern and they'll just stand at a crosswalk. And when someone walks out in the street, or someone's basically waiting to cross the street, they will mark whether or not a car waited or if they kept going. And so we can then get a percentage of compliance. We're still trying to figure out what to do with that data, because oftentimes that ends up being somewhere between half the time and 3/4 of the time. Obviously, we'd all love it to be 100%, but even at some of our most well-designed intersections with brand new raised crosswalks, it's still not 100%. So like, what is good enough? How do we get there? We don't have a ton of money to do this everywhere. So with the information we have, how do we decide which ones would get prioritized? We're still struggling with it a little bit, but we are actively thinking about it and trying to figure out whether or not it's worth it. And in some cases, I do think there is an element of comfort to it. Like even if it only makes a handful of extra people stop a day in a car, it might actually be worth it in certain circumstances to add an RFP, for example. And so that's the balancing act we're trying to perform on that. But still trying to learn and collect more data to make better decisions there.
Will,
Yes.
okay, last question.
Because you say last and then we kind of like, you go, it's good to know. Thank you, Alessandra. So I guess, big picture, like, so you have, roughly like how many traffic signals are in the city? And if one is broken, is there a way for you to tell, or do you depend on the general constituent to not pick up the phone and say, okay, this traffic signal doesn't work, like, I'm trying to.
Yeah, for most of them, yeah, that is the short answer, is we depend on people to let us know. Only those 4 that I showed you on that map on Broadway, those are the first ones that we actually have working access to, and now Davis Square as well. Before that, we had no information. We would actually have to go out there to determine if something was going wrong. So we do rely pretty much entirely on feedback from residents to tell us when a signal's not working. So it's kind of crazy when you first learn that, but like that's the state of things. And when something goes wrong, people are usually pretty quick to let us know.
Yeah, and someone who primarily manages our 311s, that come in about mobility feedback, yes, we know very quickly. There's a signal issue, and so do several other departments. I think it also helps that many of our staff are actually like deployed in the field weekly. So, right, if something's on call, or even if there is a signal issue, it's actually very quickly that we find out to what extent, like, did it go into flashing mode, right? We were having a signal just a couple weeks ago, it's that when it goes, like, kind of toggles red and it's supposed to operate as a stop sign. Or if there are kind of other issues such as like a phase skipping, but we do tend to hear about this very fast.
Yeah, because just, we gotta be thinking about the future, like with technology in our fingertip, we can keep depending on, like this AI, there's all this, like there are cities that are already doing this, that even if the street light is broken, there's a signal that some DPW person get. So at least just start thinking about, like how to kind of like revolutionize the entire system so it can, like save so much time and energy.
Yeah.
Because just make a note of this so I don't have to call 911, like at the intersection of North Street and Powder Boulevard. It's like a traffic light there that is broken. It's been there for like almost like 6 months or a year. Like we just keep passing there, even myself and Brad, like I haven't had a chance to actually pick up the phone and make a call, like just,
Yeah, we actually are with that specific example, that has been like kind of sort of integrated into that Powderhouse project over there at Alewife Brook Parkway. And so we are doing a walkthrough in a couple of weeks because that project is wrapping up. And so that's going to be something we're going to look at, is that intersection and what's going on there. So that was kind of its own special case because it did get a little bit pulled into the construction there, but we're on it.
Gotcha, thank you. Thank you, Nicole.
You're welcome. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Adam. Super helpful, super interesting. I'm sure this won't be the last time we want to talk to you about intersections and signals. So thank you. And thank you everybody else for your great questions and engagement. We're gonna move on to our, I mean, they're kind of both city updates, but our second city update, which is a preview of Mobility's approach to project planning, and then we'll dive in at a hopefully near future meeting a little bit further.
Thanks, Alessandra, and everyone. This will be quite brief, because again, it's a preview. But again, feel free to answer any questions, or I want to make sure we have substantial time on the other agenda items. So I'm gonna run through, generally, how do we come to deciding projects in the city? So we heard from you all to provide a brief introduction on how decisions are made on where to install traffic calming measures or undertake projects. Just want to keep those two terms together, right? Traffic calming are things like speed bumps and kind of quicker interventions versus the larger projects, which might be like your West Broadways or your tough streets. They do kind of follow in different pipelines. I'm going to talk about them together, but if you have any questions, kind of like, we try to kind of differentiate that, but just let me know if it's confusing. So in general, we take a whole bunch of different types of feedback to start to kind of put together a universe of projects. Specifically for traffic calming, we look at everything from when we're standing out on the street talking to folks and the comments that we hear, to city council requests, things that come in through 311, things that come in through our projects. It's, you know, just because someone would call a 311, but then they happen to tell us, hey, actually, I feel really unsafe in the streets, anything that can be done when you're working on this project. That all gets folded into kind of this universe of consideration for traffic calming. We also have traffic calming petitions, just a mechanism that was set up quite a few years ago, that if 9 or so neighbors or 33% of the street was interested in having an assessment done for traffic calming on the street, they can do that process. It is just an assessment, but it's actually a great way for us to understand the support and buy-in for traffic calming, as well as just draw more attention if we weren't already aware. And then just again, constituent emails or committee letters, so things that we hear from you. So this feeds into consideration for traffic calming, or, you know, the kind of streets that we know folks, we kind of hear more, you know, hear over and over again and prioritize. Adam spoke a little bit about our data collection efforts, but we're trying to validate both what we hear as well as what we, you know, there are staff recommendations that go into this too. We try to validate this with data. We collect data in the spring and the fall, primarily around volumes and speeds. We have been kind of dipping our toes into studies like red light running, crosswalk compliance, to really understand more of what is occurring on the street, the behavior of folks, especially as we, you know, we've heard more and more input recently, kind of since 2020, that there were a higher occurrence of red light running. So is that occurring? Can we dig into that? We can primarily conducted in fall and spring, as those are kind of like your heavier use times. Correct, Adam? Summer, right? There's no school. People might be not traveling in the ways that they often travel. You're not getting that kind of maybe more consistent use of the street. So fall and spring are really great times, and winter has its implications, right? If you have major inclement weather. Lead into that, Justin, do you know the next slide? I'm gonna talk through some of the pipelines. So there's some built-in project pipelines to deliver traffic calming. These are the ones that also allow us to do street reconstruction. So annual resurfacing program. These are those kind of yearly allotted funds that allow us to do projects like West Broadway and Tough Street. It's often a street corridor. This is either a full street or a segment of a street, depending on the length of the street. And we get to redo all the sidewalks, redo the street. There's also your capital projects. So Adam mentioned Summer Street, might all, you know, be familiar with all the work that's going on in Spring Hill right now, or a couple of years ago when Union Square was a big hole, because there was all of that capital, you know, all of that work going on with the infrastructure below. So these larger projects allow us to do some of that work. And then one which some of the newer members might not be as familiar with, some of the development in the city. There are actually projects, or sorry, work through those developments that they might put in a segment of protected bike lane or completely redo the sidewalk. So there's a way to kind of use those opportunities to put in safer street amenities. So these pipelines are largely determined by infrastructure needs. So what we mean by that, and we've got a reference here, so in these slides, we'll follow up with you. It links back to, so you might recall the meeting in March where the Director of Engineering, Brian Postlewaite, came, and he shared how do we analyze sidewalks and our street quality to determine the kind of look ahead for street reconstruction and sidewalk reconstruction. Oh, thank you, Alessandra, for sharing the slides in the chat. And then there's also utility infrastructure renewal. So those are your Spring Hill sewer. There's some of the beginnings work for more, the kind of Morrison Ave area. So those are your big buckets, right? For those larger projects that allow us, it's not really determined by the traffic code, but because of these kind of very, like knocking on the table, the very core infrastructure needs. The others are where we can do some more discretionary work. So we have a kind of new program called our Intersections Improvement Program. This is part of the resurfacing, but it really allows us to tackle those high crash locations. So this upcoming year, it's high crash locations, gaps in the pedestrian network. And in addition to where we've heard a lot of feedback about. So this year it's Cameron Ave and Tannery Brook Road and Broadway at Boston Ave, so right in front of the Ball Square Station. And the next upcoming intersections are Somerville at Central Street, a new raised intersection at Bow and Walnut Street, which has no crosswalks there last time. And then Washington Street at Rossmore Street. So kind of where those, kind of right near the police station, but where we hear a lot of other crosswalk issues, in front of New Kitchen. We are quick builds. So, quick builds are where we do paint and close, right? It's not substantial construction. And then grant funded projects. So that could be federal grants. We named one a bit about the Davis for signals. Or it could be through, a variety of different state agencies. And then to the next slide. Digging into a little bit about how we're able to select projects in these more discretionary buckets. We really try to prioritize traffic calming in locations where we believe it will have the greatest impact. We do that because, right, it's really challenging. There are limited resources, and we are trying to increase the safety as much as possible with what we have available. So we really try to hone into some priority considerations. We look at adjacent land uses. So Adam mentioned, thinking about RFPs by schools, that's also something we think for traffic calming. Schools, your public spaces, so those are your parks, other civic centers, senior centers, affordable housing. Where affordable housing too, we might have a higher proportion of families, older adults, people with disabilities, and then places of worship, again, kind of like big centers where you might have lots of folks gathering. And so again, having potentially a higher impact. We also look at our different policy plans. We've spoken a little bit about the bicycle network plan. So your neighborways in there are really being considered for lots of traffic calming. But again, our highest priority is really using our Vision Zero guidance and looking at high crash streets, high crash intersections. And then really rooting it in equity. One of the ways we do that is prioritizing environmental justice areas. And really, again, environmental justice areas are historically disinvested in. And so the city is really trying to prioritize environmental justice areas with really robust traffic calming, but also transportation investment. And then we kind of tie this all together in our annual work plan, which we try to do generally kind of at the begin or end of the calendar year into the beginning of the next one to determine our capacity for both quick build projects as well as these discretionary projects. And for these larger projects I mentioned in street corridors, they're determined a little bit more through the resurfacing program. So we have a little bit of a head start on kind of knowing where those are going to fall. But we really try to do this annually. So that data collection happens twice a year. That feeds into that pipeline for streets to consider for traffic calming, kind of determine that list. We try to, specifically for speed humps, broadcast that list in your January, February time. We do this through our newsletter, as well as we have kind of a GIS map online where you can zoom in and look. As well as get on the ground and communicate to folks who are going to see speed humps on their street. So that's a very quick run through. As I said, there's kind of those two big buckets. There's your big kind of reconstruction ones, and then your more kind of quick build and traffic calming. And I think going back to your main question of like, where does that all feed in? I mean, the feedback is always helpful. But we're really trying to kind of root our work in some of this guidance and looking at all of the work through kind of, like kind of a range of criteria, so that we're not, just going in one direction, because then we heard many, like, input is always helpful, right? But we also know, and if you ever want to dig into 311 data, this is very helpful. You might get a lot of feedback, but it might be very few people. Whereas there might be a location where we're seeing higher crashes, but we may not be actually hearing from a lot of people. So we're just trying to create a little bit more of an equitable foundation for consideration when we look at any of our projects.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kate.
No, thank you.
I see your hand. But we are also over, so I'm gonna take Will, and then if anybody else has a pressing question, then you can ask one of them. But I also want to remind you all that we will dig into this topic even more at an upcoming meeting, so just know that if you don't get to be the one person to ask a question after Will today, then we'll probably have a chance to answer it in a future meeting. Go ahead, Will.
Thank you, Alessandra. Is it Jessica?
No, my name is Kate.
Kate, okay, no, thank you for the stimulating presentation. I was just curious as to your methodology for determining the environmental justice area. How do you?
Well, a lot of it is through federal guidance. So under the US Department of Transportation, they help designate what are considered environmental justice areas, as it's a federal designation. I think it's correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's the presidential order from 1994. It's under the Clinton administration.
No, I get it. I understand. Like the whole some of it is, we are in an environmental justice community. So I'm talking about like just the specific in terms of like saying like the equity based, you're prioritizing environmental justice areas. Like, so like, how do you, which part of this, just maybe point like one or two of those areas that, just because you mentioned that it's very relevant, but how do you solve that? Like which one is it just a planning, like a document that you're hoping to now build on, or you've started doing the work and you're showing us like the pathway that you're following?
No, great question. And I'll also pull in Adam. It's really kind of looking at, we kind of talked through the priority considerations for land uses. What are some of the things that match up to our Vision Zero plan and some of our other guiding documents? And then again, we kind of think of equity and investing in environmental justice areas, kind of you're weighting different criteria. So when a street might be considered for traffic calming, it's measuring up of, do we weight it heavier because it's by a school? Do we weight it heavier because it's in an environmental justice area? Which the entire city is not exclusively all in an environmental justice area. There are kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that like East Somerville and Winter Hill are
Yeah.
two, like, very, like, those are our most prominent, environmental justice areas. Like, we have done a lot of investment with the Pearl Street project and the 6 intersections in that neighborhood, because we knew that that was an area that is one of our more prominent environmental justice communities. That also was part of the reason that we selected West Broadway, because we know that there is also a prominent environmental justice area out there. So if you're looking for like, what actual parts of the city, those are ones that we gravitate to as staff in terms of like areas that we feel pretty comfortable have been historically disinvested in Somerville that we want to try to correct.
Yeah, but we can talk offline about it. I've done work in that space for the state, so it's like when you say federal guideline, there's a lot more to that mechanics. But I see what you mean by there's no empirical studies to know that East Somerville.
Yeah.
But I want to understand like how you're pulling, you still need to now back it up by data, whether it's through income or whatever thing you're doing. There are 3 main things that you're looking at. And so like, I want to see how you dive deep to pull that data to support the work.
Yeah, the short answer is we don't have like a formula that we then use to input that. These are all things like, it's still ultimately a judgment by staff and by the city and by the office. Like, we take all of these things together, and often it's like, how many of them overlap to the point that we're like, this is something that needs to be done. It checks X, Y, and Z boxes. It's not like it gets double weight at like maybe someday, maybe we want to do that someday, but yeah, it's not like each individual environmental justice area based on the percentage of low income then factors into this. It really is still like we take all of this together and then we have conversations about what actually just practically makes the most sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Really appreciate it. Super helpful. With our last 20 or so minutes, I am very eager to jump into our subcommittee brainstorming. And I will just warn folks, online, if you were a guest, or in person if you're a guest, that this is gonna be more inside baseball about how we want to structure our committee. Which you are obviously more than welcome to stay for. It is very much public information. But also if you're just like, I don't care what subcommittees they have, you don't have to stay.
Subcommittees are sort of priority and action areas and
Totally.
people haven't.
Yeah, absolutely. We will take your input if you were here and you would like to comment on them. Absolutely. It will just be less information about like what the cities do, for example. So I'm gonna actually share, this document that Vitor primarily put it together. I just added to it a little bit before we had this meeting. So this is our subcommittee brainstorming document that we've been using. The goal of our subcommittee restructure is to take the 3 committees we currently have, which are policy and evaluation, or I'm sorry, policy and enforcement, engineering evaluation, and education and engagement, and think about whether they are actually accomplishing the goals that we want them to accomplish, and that they are aligned with the desires and interests of our committee members, new and old. And if the answer is that we want a completely different subcommittee structure, that is 100% fine. Like that would be more than supported. So there, we have some ideas about what those new subcommittees could look like based on kind of preliminary conversations with all of you and between us. But first, just some kind of higher level things to think about. We have 18 members of our committee that are not ex officio, meaning they're not members of city staff or our city council rep, and would be able to be active participants in a subcommittee. We could have 2 to 9 members per subcommittee because that would allow us to not go over quorum. We have to stay under quorum for our subcommittees, otherwise those meetings fall under open meeting law and we would need to list them and it's just too cumbersome.
Well, 9 still kind of close, because you're allowed to go to the subcommittee for a subcommittee you're not on.
Yes.
So I don't know if having 2 people at subcommittee meetings is a problem we currently have, but.
It could be.
If we think of a really cool one, everyone wants to go to.
Yeah, so 9 is definitely pushing it on that end of things. And great, thank you so much for joining, Andy. Each member could be a part of multiple subcommittees if you wanted to be, and you feel like you have the interest and the capacity, no requirement on that. The minimum expectation for each member is that you're on one subcommittee and go to the monthly meetings. And the minimum expectation for each subcommittee is monthly-ish meetings to work on the deliverables of your subcommittee. And kind of how we're thinking about at least these potential subcommittees is that they would be more structured around deliverables rather than like high level ideas as our current subcommittees kind of are. And then just to outline, this ties back to the officer nominations that I was talking about before and that Carol mentioned. Ideally, each subcommittee has a leader that is responsible for organizing and facilitating those monthly-ish meetings, as well as working with their fellow subcommittee members to set the agendas, working with the officers on, the direction and strategy of the subcommittee along with the actual members of the subcommittee, and then participating if it's relevant in kind of the not ancillary, but like the non-meeting activities of the subcommittee, like education and engagement, for example. We also do tabling, we host community walks, stuff like that. Any questions about just kind of that high level goal or those high level goals for the subcommittees, kind of what the, I don't know, expectations are. Okay, great. Do folks feel like they're familiar with our current subcommittees, or would you like a brief description of what they are? Who wants a description? Okay, education and engagement, we organize tabling events and community walks, and we also write our monthly newsletters. Theoretically, we also run our social media, but because Twitter is gone, we haven't been doing that. We do have an Instagram account that is inactive, but we could revitalize it. Engineering and evaluation, they review proposed designs for transportation planning projects like Bus Street, West Broadway, et cetera. Policy and enforcement, they monitor and lead advocacy efforts around transportation related policy matters. This can really run the gamut of interests. In the past, they've taken on snow clearing, tracking, some transportation related bills in the Massachusetts legislature. A lot of diversity there. So these are some of the ideas for a new subcommittee structure. There are 8 possible subcommittees listed here. They are not like these don't have to be the framework that we're working in. They're just some ideas. And we certainly do not have to enact all of them or any of them. So one idea would be kind of maintaining engineering evaluation with a design review subcommittee. One would be, these next 2 are kind of like pulling apart 2 of the key functions of education and engagement. One would organize all our walks and our tabling events, and the other would kind of take on the communication side of things with the newsletter and perhaps revitalizing our Instagram. And think of new ways to, and liaising with traditional media, which is not something we've really done in the past, but could be responsibility of this committee. Enforcement liaising could, kind of be a transformation from policy and enforcement, where they kind of monitor police activity in the city and liaise with one of the officers there. This would be a great place for the municipal road safety grant to fit into, which we'll hear about more in October. City council liaising could be another committee. There are a ton of transportation related matters that come through city council, and many of our city councilors are extremely amenable to and allies of safe streets. So that could be a really beneficial thing to do. Another idea we had was creating specific subcommittees that focus on kind of the 2 halves of our full committee, right? One for pedestrian experience, one for transit experience, that kind of dig deep into those elements of transportation in the city. One piece of feedback that I heard from a committee member was that maybe the transit experience one would be a little more like useful within the subcommittee structure, because we just tend to have fewer opportunities to engage on transit related matters because we don't have as much communication, like with the T, for example, whereas it's much, I wouldn't say easier necessarily, but we have, I think, a clear line of communication around like making pedestrian improvements in like a city project, for example. So that's one consideration there. And then mobility for kids. This is something that at least Carol and some others have really expressed interest in taking on. And could be really, I mean, it's always relevant, but could be especially relevant as the new school siting study and selection continues moving on. And then just one more other idea that was thrown in here was on parking regulations, which is always a hot topic. So this really is intended to be like a discussion on what folks are interested in and if anything excites them about this list or beyond. And then hopefully we would kind of form like or have like a ad hoc meeting of a smaller subgroup who really wants to like come up with a proposal that we can vote on in our next meeting on the new subcommittee structure. So I welcome everybody's thoughts after that lengthy introduction.
Looking at this list of 8, one thing I find interesting is like which ones of these could be combined. I do like the idea of splitting out sort of the events side of engineering education and like the digital communication side. But if you want to pick, I don't know if you could scroll down.
Yeah.
Like I wonder if the enforcement liaising and city council liaising could be combined into something called. I don't know, outside, I don't know what it's called.
Yeah.
Something with the word liaising in it. And I also wonder if, well, I appreciate what you said about for the transit experience, maybe one getting it, so can we just to like give it the purpose it deserves? But I do wonder if those three, actually pedestrian experience, transit experience, and the children's one they're sort of all about like kind of focus on the experience of getting around by walking in transit and I think the transit experience, as much as it deserves its own thing, walking to transit stations is such an important part of the transit experience and like the waiting environment is also the environment. So I think those three could maybe be combined if that was in the spirit of brainstorming. Those are how I start to think of grouping them. Yeah.
I'd like to present a counter point of view. I, as a new member, found the smallness of the focus very enticing and agreeable. And a little less overwhelming than the three subcommittees that we had. So for me, as I looked through, I found two right off that I thought, oh, I have time and I would be interested in those. But if they got huge, I'd be a little more daunted. So
We'd be more interested in serving on two small subcommittees than somehow combining those into one.
I would, I personally find these very attractive. I think that you did a lot of work on these and they're very focused, which I find much less threatening. When something is big, it feels more like, I don't know what all this means, and these felt very focused and very clear on what the expectations were, and the expectations felt manageable.
They were
I was
also
just-
designed to play on people's strengths. Sorry.
We'll get you next, Laura.
Because we know that some people use the bus a lot, so it makes sense for them to participate in bus-related discussions. Others use other types of activities in the city. So I think it is important to get really motivated people inside each one of the subcommittees. So real discussions can happen and with real data and real usage of those services.
Laura, before I go to you, I just want to raise Meredith's input to the group in the room, which is just support for the user experience grouping that Carol brought up. Laura, please go ahead.
One thing I'm just a little concerned about is I think that many subcommittees may be a little challenging to staff, have enough people on all the committees, especially if we are probably unfortunately likely to, lose members over time as people have life changes. And I think it may be hard to maintain quorum on 8 different committees without requiring, a lot of meetings per person. That said, I do think that I kind of like the idea of a separate transit focused subcommittee, just because I think a lot of our discussions tend to sort of gravitate more towards the pedestrian experience. And I think we give short shrift to the transit part of our duty sometimes.
Go ahead, Brenda.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to, I was wondering about, I guess, the workload of some of the current committees, because it seems to me, education and advocacy, for example, has to go out to a lot of events. So that takes a good amount of time in addition to the monthly meetings that they do. A lot of the other committees, it seems like might be writing letters and reviewing plans, which also takes a lot of time. And I also agree with Laura's point that if there is a heavier workload with some of the committees, it might be better for them to have more than just 2 or 3 members so that, people aren't getting totally swamped by the responsibilities of that committee.
I wonder if something that could be useful is like taking this as sort of a starting point proposal. Like a next step to add to be thinking about these committees as written. I agree that some of them to even function would need at least some minimum number of members. Some of the more focused ones maybe could be 2-person committees, but thinking about mapping that out. And then I wonder if there's some type of like non-committal but preliminary sign up way where the idea of having, let's say, I'll pick my favorite one, like the mobility for kids. One like might be really appealing, but if only one person signs up, if 2 people sign up to be on and neither wants to lead, then we can't have that.
Right.
And so starting to think of, I like, it could make sense to set the committee structure and then look at staffing them, but maybe the staffing is what determines that, like as much as we like the idea of having a committee on this topic. It is true, that having 8 different committees means that we have 8 committee leads and 3 officers, those are hopefully distinct people, so 11 out of the 18 members of the committee have a leadership role, which is quite a bit more than what we have now. And I think, I'll leave it at that. I think there are some people who are currently leading committees that are a little bit overextended. And I think that might be officers as well. Yeah, and so having this sort of like simultaneously figure out who would like to be on which committee, and maybe that could take the form of some type of online poll. That doesn't need to happen. So people don't have to be put on the spot to decide where they most like to participate. I think that could be useful to figure out where there's enough people to justify keeping it.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. One other thing I'll put out there that's, I think, related is, you know, if folks end up, like, if we end up having a subcommittee structure where, you know, there are like 2 people on a committee and it is a committee that like writes letters, for example, to Brenda's point, I don't think it just has to be those people who are like involved in the actual activities of the committee. For example, like education and engagement, like we would not be able to table if we didn't have like volunteers from.
Maybe the ones who coordinate, kind of like the acting secretary,
Yes.
saying the secretary, you know, so that subcommittee could be the one that reaches out to people and says, hey, we need you to help draft a letter.
Exactly. Yeah, 100%. 2 questions that I have, are, one, do you think that there is like a minimum viable number of folks to be on a committee, or is it really dependent on the actual like function of that committee? Like, would we have to kind of go case by case for each subcommittee?
I think it's case by case. Yeah, because some of the communication or the education ones, you can have 1 or 2 people who are like leads and then all of us pitch in where needed. But like the transportation and the pedestrian one, I feel like those need more involvement because you can't have 1 or 2 people make all the big decisions, right? So I feel like it would depend.
I do think the number is more than 1.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of silly to call it a committee. At that point, we call it an officer.
Yeah.
Well, some of these might not be committees at all, like the one about digital communications, for instance, could be just 1 person.
Yeah.
It's not a committee.
Like a
It's a role.
communications officer or something.
Yeah.
But I
It's a
think
role
maybe
that
we call
somebody
that,
takes
maybe
on.
that person, maybe we have a 4th
Yeah,
officer that does that.
right. So to your point, we don't need to do all or nothing. These are just ideas, and more ideas can come in as well, of course. But I am interested to know how many people would like to lead anything that they are passionate about. Because those are important. The leaders will be very important on each committee work. They're the ones pushing for activity.
And I would say maybe rather than doing a show of hands, right, where maybe we can solicit that asynchronously.
Yeah.
So you can go home and think about
Right.
what they feel comfortable with.
Yeah, to that point, and agreed. Are there any items on this list that you, or not on this list, that you feel like should be topics or deliverables that we focus on in this committee that are not already captured in one of these subcommittees? Okay, awesome. Then,
Sorry.
yeah.
One thing I can imagine E-Tech. I think this would be totally fine, but like what, if PDEC wanted to like help coordinate like Somerville does those pedestrian counts and we ask for like volunteers to help do that. Like I can imagine that being a community activity to try to like help get people to volunteer to do the count activity. Maybe that's education and engagement, but I don't know that it really fits in either of the two. I don't think that necessarily, I'm thinking things we could, this was like things we could imagine PTAS ever doing that don't fit into one of these categories. That's one that might.
Yeah. Let me just make a comment.
Or like any other kind of like voluntary thing. Like, I think we've talked, maybe it's just in my brain, I don't know if we've, talked about like helping, well, actually, this would go to the children's committee, like organizing walking school buses and things like that. Like, I guess that's also an event. So no, that's in here, that's easily represented.
Is that even feasible to the question to the town people? City people? Is it feasible for us to provide some of those internal functions that you mentioned earlier?
Like, pedestrian counts?
Data collection, I think that's the sort of thing.
Oh, the city always solicits volunteers to help with their pedestrian counts.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So it's just a question of
Actually,
PTAS wants to
gonna pitch this
contribute
soon,
to helping recruit.
Oh, sorry.
No, thank you, but yeah, no, it's something that, yeah, it's not exclusive, and I think if there was like a kind of amplifying of that volunteer request, there's more and more that we can do.
Yeah, I mean, not to put my thumb on the scale, but like, I think to expand on, like, you could expand on that in the sense of like a volunteer effort, but you could also expand on that on the data side of it. Do you guys have something captured that's like more of a planning or like splitting apart evaluation, but focusing maybe less on the design review and more on the longer term strategic stuff? I don't necessarily see captured in there, and maybe the TMCs, or sorry, the like pet counts could fit into something like that, so.
Yeah.
Also put that out there for.
I feel like, Adam, I feel like that point would kind of fit maybe into one of these experience-based
yeah.
committees of the like kind of long range strategic thinking.
Sure.
I just put that in the comments, so you read my mind.
Oh, amazing. Thank you, Meredith. Okay, then I think I'm gonna formally propose that we send around a little bit of a survey to folks, as Carol has suggested. That includes all of these committees, but also an option to add a new subcommittee if you think of another one. That will also allow you to indicate whether or not you feel compelled to lead one of these subcommittees, or simply to join one of them. And then we can I think go from there. How would people feel about having kind of a ad hoc meeting between this meeting and the next meeting in September to draft a formal proposal based on the survey results and tonight's discussion?
Sure.
Like yeah, would that be the full committee or?
No, just like a group of
like I said,
whoever
like
wants to do it.
yeah, an ad hoc subcommittee, yeah.
Exactly.
I was almost wondering for like a couple of the items that are on here, like snow clearing or something like that, that could be like a seasonal meeting or two rather than necessarily. Like, there's some items that would be great to address with like separate meetings, but not a committee. Responsibility.
Snow clearing could fit really neatly in one of the liaising ones or in the experience. And the point of snow clearing is to improve the experience.
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like both of those probably are best served rolled into something else. I'm not sure which, I guess it depends on what categories everybody agrees on, but I agree that I don't think it's enough to like merit its own separate meeting.
Hey, Joel. Cool. Then do I have a second for the formal proposal that I just made? Thank you, Satoko. All in favor of filling out a survey?
Hi.
All opposed? Okay, amazing. And I'll give you a date for filling it out, so that we can schedule a meeting for anybody who's interested in drafting something formal. Thank you all so much. This was extremely productive. Thank you again to Adam and Kate for your really helpful presentations, and we'll see you all again in September.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Brenda. Good night, everyone.